Thank you so much, Carolina. Can you hear me? Is that working? Okay, perfect. So then I will just start. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. First of all, to talk to you about the research project that I did for my PhD in Münster under the supervision of Peter Funke, who I saw is in the audience today, and Matthias Hacke. Yeah, I'm always happy to revisit the topic and to present it. So as Carolina mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about explorating or analyzing social interactions between people in correspondence corpora with social network analysis as a method of choice. In this case, we're going to be talking about it in the context of the Zenon archive as a use case, which is what I focused on for my doctoral studies in Münster. Before we dive in, I would quickly like to go over the outline of today's presentation. So I will start with a little bit of context about the Zenon archive and the sources that were used for this research project. Then I will go over the data collection strategies and what I have done and how I have managed the data for the project. Then we'll move on to the modeling of the interactions and relationships which were analyzed, and then we'll look over at some of the, not all of them, but some of the networks which were then resulting from these data sets and what kind of insights we can derive from them. Then we move on to maybe the most important part of the central part of the research, which is how to, using this method, this approach, how to identify social actors of interest in a large corpus. We will, of course, also take a look into the relationships and interactions themselves and how we can generate or talk about them, an overview of them and what we collected from the texts. And at the end, very briefly, I would like to address the so-called elephant in the room, which are the large language models, and how they can contribute to this type of research, or how their usage can contribute to this type of research. So starting with the Zenon archive, this is a large corpus of papyri, of documentary papyri from the 3rd century BC Hellenistic Egypt, and it takes the name of Zenon, who was an immigrant that came from Caria, from the city of Kaunos, to Egypt, looking for opportunities like many other Greek immigrants that flocked to Egypt, to Ptolemaic Egypt more specifically, looking for the many of opportunities promised by the Ptolemies at that time. He went to Egypt with the task of working under Apollonius, who was the finance minister of the Ptolemies at that time, and therefore a very important individual in the administration, responsible for taxation, agriculture, coin mining, minting, and so on. And Zenon was therefore then working for him in different positions and with different roles in his work with Apollonius, but mainly, or for the most part of his career, he was working as the manager of a large estate that was given to Apollonius by the king of Egypt at the time. And this estate was located in the Fayum, and that was a gift estate, like I mentioned, was given to Apollonius by the king with the goal of showcasing the potential of this land. So the Fayum is a depression that's located right below the delta of the Nile River. And in this geographic depression, then a lot of water from the Nile River was accumulating. So the Ptolemies undertook a great project of land reclamation, which had the objective of making this land cultivable and therefore profitable for them. And thereby they needed to make this region attractive to people for cultivation. And one of the strategies was to gift plots of land to people who could then cultivate it and showcase its potential to other prospective settlers. Another strategy of the Ptolemies was also to settle military men in the land as form of payment, of gaining loyalty, and also of cultivating the land. So there was a great influx of Greek immigrants also in the region of the Fayum, not only in Ptolemaic Egypt as a whole. And this also promoted some agricultural experiments in the area with the introduction of some crops to cater the needs of this new influx of Greek immigrants. So in this Multicultural in this varied context is where Zenon was then operating as a manager of this estate, and then he was in contact with various different people and types of people in different positions, workers, slaves, but also people in the central administration in Alexandria. And the documents that he collected, documents that he was dealing with in his daily dealings, were then collected in this archive that takes his name because it was likely collected by him, but there are also documents from his predecessor, Panakestor, and his successors, a couple of his successors. And these documents, they were of varied kind as well. There were several accounts of payments in kind and in cash, also in drachmas and the currency of the Ptolemies, and also lists, but also a lot of very interesting and full of nuanced information, types of documents such as petitions, letters, and memoranda as well. And this paper trail, so to say, that was collected likely by Zenon, luckily came to us, which gives us a lot of information about how people lived at the time, right? And this is exactly the type of document that we're working with when we're working with documentary papyri, but also very specifically with the Zenon archive. So as I mentioned, this is a very large archive for this period of history, particularly. There were, at the time that I was doing my PhD research, around 1,845 papyri that are attested or set, defined to belong to the Zenon archive, and this number is not that one anymore because of the context of finding of the archive as well. So at the time, as well, the Zenon archive is likely to have surfaced in 1911, around 1911, but it wasn't found by archaeologists. It was rather found by local farmers in Egypt that were looking for archaeological artifacts, but also for fertilizer, the sebak, which was the earth mixed with archaeological remains that was very rich and nutritious for the soil. And when they were found then, as the documents of the archive, they were sold for different people, for different collectors in different groups, chunks of the archive, so to say. The largest part of the archive was acquired by the Cairo Museum with the help of Campbell Cohen Edgar, who worked also as a director of the Cairo Museum and ended up publishing 5 volumes of the Cairo papyri from this purchase. And editing and publishing then these 5 volumes. And this is the group, the subset, so to say, of the Zenon archive that I have worked with in my PhD. For some reasons, for the feasibility of looking over these documents in the scope of a PhD research, I needed to define a subset, and it was very unlikely to be able to really achieve a random subset, so I decided to work with the 5 volumes published by Edgar. But there are several other collections of the Zenon archive in different locations, and researchers and papyrologists are still working with these documents and other papyri. So it can happen, and it still happens, that different fragments are assigned to a single document, and therefore the total number of papyri and documents assigned to the Zenon archive or related to the Zenon archive can still vary, and has varied since I have concluded my PhD research. As you can see in this pie graph to the right side, we see that there is a large number of letters, which is very interesting for this type of research, which focuses on interpersonal relationships and interactions, because it's exactly this kind of document which gives us the most insightful information on the matter. Petitions are also very interesting, and the accounts, they are potentially very interesting, but for this specific case, not always we know in these accounts of payments, for example, who is exactly paying whom. Sometimes you have a list of who has received money or only a list of who has given something, but it's not clear exactly who has given to whom, and therefore they were also not considered for this research. Luckily, for the Zenon archive and for many other archives, these texts are online available in different digital papyrological resources. Most famously, also for my research, most used were the papyri.info, which is the Duke databank of documentary papyri, and also Trismegistos. So what you can see in, for example, these 2 resources is that in many cases for the Zenon archive, even the pictures of the papyri are available in different resolutions. But I haven't worked with those. I have worked only with the texts, which is also available on papyri.info and on Trismegistus digitized. So very convenient for computer methods, for processing with computer methods. And also a lot of very insightful metadata, especially in Trismegistus, they have the annotated text. So every word of these texts is also annotated with synthetic information, parts of speech, and so on, which I haven't used so much for my research, but it's definitely very useful. What I have indeed used a lot for the research is the list of attestation of places and people per document. So every document, every text of the Zenon archive on Trismegistus has a list of all of the mentioned people in that text, which leads to their database of people who every individual then has their unique identifier. Every attestation of that individual has also unique identifiers, which I have also used for processing the data locally. And that's exactly what I did. So I collected the data then automatically with a web scraping script that was written for this research. And I collected this data from these two sources and stored them locally, organized also the data that was collected locally for the purposes of my research, and then enriched this database, this local database, with information about interactions and relationships that I have interpreted and observed in the sources. Which leads us to maybe the question, okay, now I have this local database with all of this information about this subset of the Zenon archive. What do I want to do with it? So this was motivated largely by my own questionings in the beginning of my PhD. I wanted to look at this archive. I wanted to work with documentary papyri, but I was rather overwhelmed with the quantity of sources available. I have, before that, only worked with literary sources, which in this case are very limited for the Hellenistic period, and Polybius, Theodotus, and so on. You can get through all of them maybe in a week or two. And all of a sudden, I was confronted with this large number of sources. And I started thinking, and that's where my research rather shifted to a methodological focus on how to process large quantities of data in historical research. How can I actually sift through these sources and find what is relevant for the historical questions that interest me? And of course, we can work, when we're working with text-based data, we can think about searching for text matches, like string matches, looking for specific words or combinations of words, or even some patterns using regular expressions. But what happens when we're interested in more complex context concepts? What happens when I'm interested in individuals who are influential, politically influential, or powerful, or act as economic hubs in a specific period or based on a specific corpus? So that was my question, and I wanted to address, or to try to find a solution or propose a solution for this using social network analysis, because that was very fitting to the type of questions that were interesting to me at the time, which were exactly orbiting this realm of influence, political power, connection, and so on. Which leads us then to modeling these interactions and relationships. So first of all, before I go into that, disclaimer, models are tools, are ideas, ways of summarizing what we're interested in, and we cannot fit all complexity of reality into them. So of course, depending on your research question, what I did might not fit, and it definitely does not encompass all aspects of reality, but it's a useful tool to address specific, interesting parts of what you're trying to analyze. And therefore, I have looked at it. So if we look from the bottom up, from this scheme on the right side of the slide, at social interactions as the basic unit of, let's say, social structure or social fabric, which is when two individuals, or you could also interpret this as group of individuals, even though for the scope of my research, I have only considered named individuals and not groups, as so the basic unit. So when a person and another person in a point in time, very discrete, they interact with each other in a mutually meaningful behavior. And when this occurs, in many other occasions, we have the manifestation of a relationship. But of course, relationships, they are not only observed in the sources when a repeated interaction or repeated interactions of different types between the same two individuals occur. This is not the only manifestation of a relationship in historical sources. We also have explicit manifestation of relationships when we have, for instance, let's say the sentence, person A is son of person B. The relationship, the familial relationship is already described. So the model encompasses these two manifestations of relationships, both as the repetitive appearance or occurrence of isolated interactions between individuals and the explicit description of a relationship. And it's important also to include this very minimal occurrence of an interaction, because it's very often the case in such sources that two individuals interact once, or a individual appears in the corpus once and then never again. So yes, it's a very unique, let's say, piece of information that we don't want to lose, because this type of interaction might occur in different contexts between different other pairs of individuals, but maybe this A and B interaction is not so meaningful in the big picture. And when we take into account both social interactions and relationships, we have then a picture, a possible picture of social structure for this specific period based on how it's represented in this specific data set or corpus of sources. And how did this happen in practice? How did I do that in practice? So basically I read through the texts, and they are in ancient Greek. Several of them are translated, not all of them are translated, so I needed to read through them. Of course, I was never relying only on the translation, but actually going through the text in Greek. And first step is to identify all of the individuals who are mentioned by name in the sources. So here we have on the right side a translation by White from this document, from the Zenon archive, and then you have Demetrius to Zenon greeting as the first sentence, the opening of the letter, and this denotes already an interaction of the type of like a communicative act between Demetrius and Zenon. If you don't know anything about the Zenon archive, if you haven't read any other text of the archive, you know at the very least that Demetrius and Zenon exchanged information, exchanged words. And you don't necessarily know whether that happened again or not. So this is an interaction. If you continue through the text, I have spent my travel allowance because of some purchases in Tyre. Therefore, you would do well to give 150 drachmas to Nikadas, who has brought the letter to you. So here we have three interesting interactions. So you have, you would do well to give 100 drachmas to Nikadas, in which Demetrius, the author of the letter, instructs Zenon, asks Zenon to give this amount of money to a third person. So you have the request as an interaction. Then you also have to give 150 drachmas to Nikadas, which would be an interaction between Zenon giving this amount of money, this transfer of some sort of good to Nikadas. We don't know whether that happened, but it could have happened. That's what Demetrius is asking him to do. And then we have Nikadas, who has brought the letter to you, you in this case being Zenon, who is referenced here by a pronoun. So it's likely to assume that Nikadas did bring the letter to Zenon, because the letter did end up in the Zenon archive, and we have it now here in front of us. The text could also be that this letter found another way into Zenon's hand, and it wasn't Nikadas who brought it to Zenon. For the purposes of my research, this is irrelevant, and it's also quite irrelevant whether Zenon ended up giving the money to Nikadas or not, because what I was interested in was the possible interactions, what was considered to be reasonable, or a reasonable interaction or relationship between any two individuals in any two specific roles in that society. So I have registered both of them, Zenon giving 100 drachmas to Nikadas and Nikadas bringing the letter to Zenon, as possible interactions, which give me a better picture, my understanding of the interactions that were possible and the societal roles that these individuals were occupying in the period. What is important to say is that it is possible, or in the case of my database, it was possible to register also which kind of interaction that was. If it's explicitly said in the text that something has happened according to this text, or if it's something that I have interpreted from the text, or something that I have speculated also from the text. So if we want to remove all of the uncertain interactions or relationships and just analyze those who have been explicitly described in the text, that is also possible. So basically, this process of reading through and interpreting these interactions and relationships has repeated itself through all of the around 886 documents and texts of my subset. That was basically what I was doing. So this was a manual work of interpreting and registering and notating all of these information. And when you do that, what happens in the end is that you have between any given two pairs of individuals that appear in the text, several, sometimes hopefully, interactions between them, which in the network representation become an edge of a certain specific weight, which represents the strength of the connection between these two people, how often they interacted with each other, which is similar to how I modeled then a relationship with the reoccurrence of an interaction. And when an interaction is already described, so in this case, we have several interactions between Zenon and Apollonius, who was his boss, who worked for Apollonius. You can also have just the description. Zenon is an agent of Apollonius, and this has a stronger weight because we already know that this, in our model, represents ongoing interactions between these two people. What was the first conclusion when I observed the network that came out of this work? It was that Zenon and Apollonius were the most central and well-connected nodes of the network, which is completely unsurprising. Zenon is the name, it gives his name to the archive. Of course, he's central, of course, he's important. And most of the documents are related to the administration of the gift estate of Apollonius and to Zenon's work under Apollonius, even though there are several documents also about Zenon's own private business in the Fayum. It's also unsurprising that Apollonius is a very central individual. So how do we go beyond from this? Is a question that we will see in this analysis, but so you have an idea of how these networks look like. Here we have the relationships network with Zenon and Apollonius. They are very central, but you observe very interesting characteristics of this network. So first of all, we see that the giant component, which is the largest connected component of the network, here in the middle is not so giant and not so large, but we have a lot of small groups of 2 nodes or 3 nodes, and some of them are bigger nodes. And here on the top, you can see the color of the edges, the connections between these nodes, and what does that mean? So you see that the large majority is of pink edges, which represent kinship and household relationships. And then you have also a lot of the green edges, which are the work relationships. What does this mean? So you can see here that this means that it was used a lot. It was a very typical way of identifying someone, and identity markers were exactly kinship, work relationships, and also ethnic markers. So here we have one example of Zenon. His whole identification in a very formal document would have been Zenon, son of Agreophon, and here we have a relationship of kinship. From Kaunos, an ethnic marker of where he comes from, in the service of Apollonius, the finance minister. And here identifying Zenon through his employer, and we have here the work relationship, which is exactly what explains this shape of the network, and also the large majority of the relationships being those of kinship, because these are people who we know who their fathers were, because they are identified in the text through a patronymic identifier. When we look at the interactions network, we see a different picture. We see a lot of the nodes are orbiting around Zenon, which is also unsurprising. And Zenon is a very large disruptive network node in the network. What do I mean by disruptive? If we know that he's important, we are probably more interested in the nodes around him, and we want to know which of these nodes are important as well. And when Zenon is in the picture, it's really difficult to see the role that the other nodes are playing in the network. So removing Zenon of the network to attenuate his disruptive effect was one of the strategies that I have used to look beyond Zenon and beyond Apollonius and try to find other individuals of interest here. And his removal has such an impact that 135 of the nodes which are connected to the giant component, so in this image you can only see the giant component, you don't see the subgroups and the isolates. The 135 of these nodes become disconnected from the giant component when Zenon is then removed from the network. Well, before we go on, it's also important to say, of course, this is based from Zenon's perspective, so we don't have any evidence, we don't have documents about how these individuals might have been communicating among themselves, apart from that which is part of the Zenon archive itself. So removing Zenon doesn't mean that these people become removed from the social group. It means that in this archive, how these connections are described in the text of the archive, they become disconnected. But we cannot say anything for sure beyond that. How do we then move on from that to identify these individuals of interest? So to reduce this overshadowing impact of Zenon, as I mentioned, we filter Zenon out. We remove the isolates that are then generated by the removal of Zenon. So these 135 nodes, they are not part of the analysis anymore because Zenon makes them disconnected from the other nodes. They don't bring any then insightful information to us. And then we analyze 3 very typical network measures for social network analysis and for analyzing a person when it's social based on a person's network, to identify their centrality, their influence, and their relative importance in the network, which are the between centrality, which is a measure often used to identify individuals who are powerful in a social group or who act as a bridge between different nodes or different groups of nodes. We also look at weighted degree. Degree is basically a measure that says how many connections and how strong these connections are from any given individual in a network, and or close connectivity of this individual in a network. And then also eigencentrality, which is a measure that's often used to identify nodes who are considered to be prestigious or influential in a social network. We can also manipulate network composition by applying filters and generating subgraphs. Like I said, there's a lot of information classifications of these relationships and interactions. So it's possible to generate subsets of these interactions and networks data and then analyze those resulting networks. So as I mentioned before, the example that I gave was if you want only certain or explicitly described, textually described interactions, you could generate a subnetwork of that and then analyze just that. And then you confront the results that you achieve with that with qualitative analysis. And this means nothing else than you generate a list of suspects, so to say, and then you go back to the sources and you do traditional historian work of trying to make sense of these results, trying to explain why it appears as it is, because we did nothing other than structure, interpretation processes that we would do without a quantitative analysis anyways. So it should be connected to how you would look to the sources in a qualitative research approach as well. And you try to make sense of that, as I just said. And here we can see, for instance, in these 2 bar graphs below the network measures, we have on the left side the weighted degree values, which show how closely and strongly connected the nodes are. And we see Apollonius at the top. Again, like I said, unsurprising. The number 2 is Panakestor, which was the predecessor of Zenon in the administration of this large estate. So far, everything makes sense. And then we have Amintas and Tobias. And Tobias was a very influential individual in Transjordan. And this is where things get quite interesting, because you see that he's the 4th ranking individual in weighted degree values, meaning that he's probably has many connections or very strong connections or even both. But when you look at the bar graph on the top, that's a frequency of attestation graph. It shows the top 20 most frequent 20 or 30 most frequently attested individuals in the dataset. And Tobias doesn't show up, meaning that he has less than 36, which is the least mentioned person that shows up in this graph, less than 36 attestations in the archive. So he appears not so often, and yet he shows up having a very strong or very many connections. And this reflects what we know when we look at these sources with a qualitative approach, what we already know about these sources as a community of researchers. Tobias, as I mentioned, was a very influential individual in Transjordan, and he appears in less than 10 texts in the Zenon archive, and in these texts he's associated with very many individuals. If I'm not mistaken, there are 2 sales contracts in the archive in which Tobias appears, and the people who work for him appear, and it's then so it's a relationship, it's a strong tie, and it's listed all of the people who work for him. And he's also connected to the king, and this also appears in these documents. So we achieved an information that we can confirm by what we know from these sources. And when we look at the right side, then we have their betweenness centrality values. And even though we have Apollonius right at the top, we have other individuals like Damis, Kriton also at the top, showing us that these individuals had central position in the network, which also can be explained when we go back into the sources and look at who these people were. So what did we achieve by doing that? We were able to reduce from 2,295 mentioned individuals in all of the texts to a list of 19 suspects. 19 suspects of being relevant individuals in this corpus, in this subset of document of the Zenon archive. And from these 19 people, these 19 individuals, only 3 were, let's say, false positives, so people who were indeed not so relevant. And this was very easily identifiable upon close examination of just reading the text in which they appear. And this happened to Leptines, Nicandros, and Midicon, who are relatives, and they appeared in a document, and their relationships were three times made explicit in this document, and therefore they were very closely connected, having high weighted degree values and showing up in one of these top 10 highest ranking individuals in these measures. So that's why they ended up in the list. But as I said, one methodological approach does not go without the other. So we cannot just generate these lists and the networks and then our job is done. No, we need to conjugate that with qualitative analysis. And when we do that, we can also curate the results and remove all of those results that do not make so much sense. We can also look at the relationships and interactions and what types of relationships and interactions were observed in the corpus. When it comes to the relationships, we also saw it when we were looking over the graph. Why these types of relationships, they come up so often because they were used as identity markers to identify people in certain types of documents. And it's also very important to say that I didn't want to start with the top-bottom approach. I didn't want to have a list of relationships and a list of interactions and then just use these labels as I go through the text. I wanted to use a little bit of what the text presents and then categorize all of the relationships and interactions on as much as a bottom-up approach as I could. So the way that I did that is I read through the texts and labeled them as they sounded to me at the moment that I was reading them. So it took several months to go over the text for the first time and register and annotate all of these interactions and relationships. And let's say that in the first month, I saw a transaction and an exchange of goods between 2 individuals, and I registered that as an interaction of the type transaction. And then 5 months later or 2 months later, I was looking at a similar relationship, but on that day I wrote exchange of goods. So I did this until I finished with all of the documents, and then I revisited all of these documents and I consolidated all of these categories. So I grouped all of the categories that had the same meaning or were similar to each other and consolidated them under a label. So first going through the sources and making sense of that, and then going back and consolidating that in the category. So all of these 2 examples that I gave, like transaction and exchange of goods, would have fallen into request as a consolidated label. And I did the same for the relationships, even though with the relationships it was a little bit easier to do that. But you can observe, if you are also an ancient historian or familiar with the topics, that I don't have oikos as a category, for example. Even though I'm working with the Greek sources, this was an explicit decision to go bottom up and try to get the relationships as they are represented in the sources, and then go back and not use a predefined category, even if it's very well accepted and used in the field among researchers. Yeah, so we come to, like I said before, the elephant in the room, the large language models. As I mentioned, the work of registering and annotating these interactions and relationships took several months because I was doing that manually and carefully, and very often it took translating the text and checking a lot of information to do that. And there is a lot of potential for automating this process with large language models nowadays. I haven't done so much research in that, and so this is really a very short report of an experiment, if you will. How could we do that? How could we go about making this process of annotating these interactions and relationships a bit more efficiently with the help of LLMs? And this is a zero-shot prompt suggestion that I have experimented with on a couple of occasions, and has also optimized this prompt itself with the help of LLMs, with the help of ChatGPT, which is the model that I use for this. Let's go through it. You are a historian who's specializing in, and then you can insert your specialization, because I believe that this approach doesn't fit only to the Zenon archive or to Hellenistic texts, but could also be abstracted to be used in different historical contexts, and also in other different contexts in, for example, correspondence corpora. I will provide you with the text of a historical document, and your task is to identify all interpersonal interactions present in the text and output them as a JSON array. So I left the relationships out for this experiment. I focused only on the interactions. Each object in the array should represent a single interaction between two individuals, named or referred to cover all the cases in which a person is referred to by a pronoun, and must include the following fields: a letter ID. This is very important when we're working then with the social network later, and in general important, which is a short unique identifier for the document. You can provide it. In this case, in the example that I will show here, I used the dummy ID just for the purposes of this experiment, but you could use, for instance, the Trismegistos ID. The source is the person initiating the interaction, and the target is the person receiving or affected by the interaction. And then you have the edge types, an array of interaction types chosen from the following control vocabulary. So here I did differently than what I did in my research. So here there is a list that is given to the model. And this way, I also think it would work better with the model than letting it come up with its own labels. And these are not the labels that I have worked with in my research. These are other labels just for the purposes of this experiment, as I mentioned. And also a difference between what I did and what's done here is that in my case, a label was exclusive to an interaction. So you cannot have two labels, like interaction of exchange and family. It's either an interaction on exchange or in family. And in this case, one or more label can be assigned to a single interaction. And then a description, which is a short summary in English, 1 or 2 sentences of the nature of this interaction based on the evidence in the text. And then certainty, explicit if the interaction is directly stated in the text, and implied if it's inferred from context. I also added the instruction to not include deities, places, or objects, so just interactions between people, and also allowed it to include interactions with unnamed individuals. In my research, that wasn't present. So if the name of a person had been lost in a papyrus fragment, for instance, it was not considered. Or if I couldn't really say who this person was also not considered, and groups were also not considered, due to the difficulty then of the effect this would have on the network, because we could have a lot of single nodes of unnamed people who actually refer to the same person, but we don't know because we don't have this information anymore. So I didn't include it. And this was the result. I filled it in, I said specializing in Hellenistic texts. I gave a dummy ID, project ID underline 000, and I gave the text in Greek as it was in papyri.info. Could have done it with a translation. I think it would work also better with an English text. And this was the result. So 5 different interactions were observed in this text, which is not bad at all. The result is really not bad. It's of course different than what I did, what you will find in my database for the same text, because also some aspects of how I register the interactions are different. And as I mentioned before, in both cases, in what I did and in this approach, you still need human expert curation of these results to control whether something is missing, whether something is incorrect or not fitting to the expected standards that will then later on be flattened when you're looking at the network. So we really need to have a good data set, a clean data set, so that you can then later on trust what the network representation is showing you, because otherwise this information is all flattened and you only see the nodes and the edges, and you can make conclusions which are not very accurate. Yeah, so this was, like I said, a very short experiment. I think there is potential in including LLMs in the workflow, but I haven't experimented so much with it. And considering that I gave it text in ancient Greek, I think the results are actually quite acceptable. Of course, as I said, needs to be curated. And what are my conclusions with this? We finally got to that point. So I think not only the result of it having led to the conclusion, successful conclusion of my PhD, the data set that I generated during this research, I didn't address every single possible aspect of it in the PhD, in the dissertation. And there's still a lot that can be covered. So I think that there's a lot of potential and opportunity for future research there, especially when it comes to filtering the data sets. I also did not deal with time as a factor, so dynamic time network, so you can see the changes. I haven't done that. That's also a potential for the same data set to be used in further research. Furthermore, I think that the methodological approach can be reused in different contexts. So this can be applied, like I mentioned, not only for corpora of the Hellenistic period or even of Ptolemaic Egypt, but in other historical and maybe non-historical contexts as well, to analyze interpersonal interactions, which can be extracted from text data. And finally, the process of extraction of data, as we just discussed now more recently in this presentation, can be optimized, can be accelerated with the use of technologies that we have available to us nowadays that I didn't have or wasn't so versed in using it when I was doing my PhD. And with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions and to discuss any of the topics further.